My name's Joss Colster. I'm the BSI London Hub, and today we're going to be doing a training session on complexity theory. We're going to learn about all these ideas, models, and so forth in the area we call complexity theory. I'm just letting a few more people join here. And we'll get started very soon. It's 1 hour today. What we're looking at is taken from this guide here. You can see on complexity theory. And I'll share now with you a link to where we are. This mirror board. Hope you'll join me here because we'll be doing some exercises as we go along on our mirror board. So I'll share in the chat. Here it is, the link to our mirror board. And you can jump in here. You'll find this guide here. And if you click on it, you'll see a link there. And that will take you to the guide on our website, which is a lot of the content we'll be covering today. It's really a kind of a high level, kind of rapid express introduction to complexity theory. And let me jump into that. So what is complexity theory? This is, we might say, an area of science, a new area of science. It's developed during the 20th century. And it's going to help us understand complex systems that we'll talk about in a minute. So complexity theory is a set of ideas, a set of frameworks used for modeling and analyzing complex systems within a variety of different areas, many different areas. It's actually, I'll show you now, it's developed from these different areas over here, right? So it's very kind of interdisciplinary science. It cuts across a lot of different areas. A lot of this stuff is actually quite technical. It's coming from mathematics. It's coming from physics, some from ecology, biology, engineering, economics, chemistry, so on and so forth. There's even some philosophy in here, psychology for sure, a lot of computer science also. So it's essentially coming from any area where people have come across complex systems and have thought about how to try and understand them, how to model them, how to analyze them, how to actually understand them and develop models for better working with them. But you can see here, maybe you've seen this before, it's a map of complexity science and how it developed over the 20th century. So it's just one kind of perspective on all of this, a lot of this coming from systems theory. We talked in our last training session a month ago about systems thinking. So obviously complexity theory is really an extension of systems theory. Cybernetics, a lot of it coming, kind of developing in tandem with computer science, artificial intelligence, so on and so forth. So you can see up here, there's a lot of stuff around chaos theory. We'll be talking about fractals, nonlinear systems. Down here, self-organization, emergence, so on and so forth. These are ideas we'll talk about. A lot of kind of stuff coming from computational science down at the bottom, agent-based modeling. Maybe you've heard some of these ideas, maybe not. There's a lot of models, a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to go into all the details today, but that's just to give you an idea. And most of it starting back 60s, 70s, and then developing more into kind of network science up here in the 2000s as we got into the new world of the internet and social networks and so forth, computational modeling, so on and so forth. And this is how I kind of structure it when I'm normally teaching it into four. Like I say, this is a vast area. You could spend many years. I spent many years studying this and still haven't, discovered the whole thing. You could spend the rest of your life. There's a lot of different models and methods and tools here. So this is generally how I structure. We have stuff around self-organization and emergence over here, synchronization, pattern formation. We'll talk about that, non-linear dynamics and chaos theory, a lot of stuff around network theory, which is really central to this. And also complex adaptive systems. You may have heard of those. We actually won't touch on those today because we'll be talking about that next month. So we'll mainly we'll start off talking about self-organization. It's really important. How does order emerge in complex systems? We'll talk about that there. Then we'll talk a bit about nonlinear systems, nonlinear dynamics, chaos theory, so on, and a little bit around network theory. And we'll take it from there. Like I said, it's very kind of high level. It's kind of conceptual. We're just trying to get the basic ideas here. We won't be jumping into everything today. First question, though, is why would we be interested in this? Like I say, a lot of this stuff is pretty technical. It's coming out of science and so forth. Why we're doing a series here on systems innovation. Why would we be interested in complexity theory? And the main reason is because the systems we're dealing with, the systems we want to change in systems change, they are complex systems. They are complex adaptive systems. And we're not really going to be able to work with them. We're not really going to be successful in a sustainable way in trying to enable change and work with these systems unless we really understand them, right? It'd be like me sending you to work in a restaurant, and if you didn't understand that restaurant or a hotel or something, there's no way you can manage it. You might get lucky for a couple of days, but pretty shortly it would fall to bits. And it's kind of the same here. We're not going to be able to do systems innovation in a successful way if we don't really understand the systems we're working with. So that's why we want to learn a bit about complexity theory, because it's going to help us understand complex systems and work with them, which is actually not what we normally do, right? This little graphic kind of explains a lot of what we normally do. We generally know that the world is a pretty complex place out there, but we come up with these kind of simplifying models to try and get our head around it, because it's sometimes too complex. We build these kind of simple linear models for us to make sense, and it gives us a sense of order. It gives us a sense of predictability. It gives us a sense of control and so forth, and certainty and so forth. These are kind of deep psychological things we want. But when we look outside the door here and we see what a mess a lot of things look like, or how complex things look like, we feel a deep kind of uncertainty, unease, right? Loss of control. When things are very complex, dynamic environments, we lose a lot of that predictability and sense of kind of comfort and control and so forth. So complexity theory actually is going to help us kind of, if we understand these ideas, then we can start to understand how complex systems work, and we won't be so afraid of them, and we'll be able to make more sense of them, right? And we'll be able to embrace that complexity. That's the whole thing here. You'll hear people talk a lot about that when they talk about systems thinking. We're trying to embrace complexity instead of doing this stuff here, rolling in McKinsey and so forth to tell us, you know, do this, do that, the analytical thing, and you'll get the pot of gold and how wonderful all that looks. We're saying, well, it's not really the way the world works. It's not really the way complex systems change. You know, they're these big, messy things, right? And we need to kind of understand them on their own terms. And that's what we're trying to do here with complexity theory. Real world issue. The real issue is that you're in an increasingly complex and unpredictable world. Your calculations and executive planning an attempt to control the uncontrollable, right? We're trying to work with the world, deal with these systems as accepting that they are complex systems. Healthcare systems, financial markets, global supply chains, your neighborhood, your city, these are complex systems, and we're trying to understand them and work with them. And that's really why we want complexity theory. Probably the number one reason we fail to be successful in our endeavors to tackle complex issues is due to our failing to understand and work with complexity. Successful interventions into complex systems requires a basic understanding of complexity theory. We don't need to be experts, right? We don't need to understand all the science. We just need a few ideas so that we kind of get the basics of how they work and start to recognize they aren't linear, right? They aren't going to kind of conform to very simple models. And a lot of the findings from complexity science run counter to our intuition and traditional linear ways of thinking, right? A lot of us are grounded. We talked about this before, the reductionism and holism. A lot of us are grounded and taught in school and so forth about reductionism and that way of looking at the world. And it doesn't really help us when dealing with complex systems. So we're trying to kind of become aware of that and shift it to this kind of more holistic, networked complexity paradigm. So for this reason, it's important that we're aware of these features to complex systems before making interventions. Otherwise, our best made plans may well fail by simply operating under the wrong assumptions, right? We take assumptions from the simpler worlds, and we quite often take them and we plonk them on a complex world. not realizing that actually these complex systems work very differently and we need to change our assumption. And I would say that's kind of the number one reason. If our thinking is fundamentally mismatched with the reality that we're dealing with, we're not going to go anywhere really in our endeavors, or not sustainably kind of move forwards. Okay, so that's why. That's a little bit about, you know, what complexity is, or complexity theory, where it comes from. It's this modeling framework, set of ideas that's going to help us understand complex systems. It comes from all these different areas, mathematics, physics, and so forth. Back in the 20th century, it's still very active and developing. There's a lot of different areas. We need it as systems innovators, as systems changes, as people trying to manage organizations and so forth, because that's fundamentally what we're dealing with. That's the nature of the reality that we're dealing with, and we need to kind of accept it on its own terms, and then we'll be able to work with it and be much more successful.
For example, in our case, we define as half. That would be very easy.
Could we all mute ourselves?
But when I define like Romeo love.
There we go. Okay. So that's great, but what is a complex system, right? This is all about understanding complex systems. What is a complex system? So here, complexity is a property of systems. We talked last time about systems. This thing here is a system, right? It's a set of elements, and there's some relations between them that make them interdependent as a whole system, right? That's the system, and systems can be simple or they can be complex. And complexity is a property. So some systems are simple and some are complex. And complexity is a property of system. Systems that are complex have many parts that are interconnected and interdependent. Complex systems consist of many parts, many elements interacting on many different levels. Complexity arises when these parts come to have many interconnections between them. Likewise, interdependence between the parts is also a central characteristic of complexity. So parts can't be fully separated out or isolated, but form synergies with feedback loops. So at the same time, the other aspect here is around autonomy and kind of diversity, right? While the parts of a complex system may be interdependent, they typically also have high degrees of autonomy and or adaptive capacity. Elements have a degree of autonomy, often through their capacity to adapt to their local environment according to their own set of instructions, which means that the system may organize itself in different ways and is not determined by some top-down global centralized organizing principle, but instead may exhibit self-organizing behavior and evolutionary dynamics. So the complexity kind of comes from the fact that you have these parts that are interconnected and interdependent, but they're also autonomous and they can make their own decisions. So Peter Senge often gives the example when he's talking about systems and complexity of a family, right? So this thing here would be very simple if it was, you know, 3 stones or whatever and a bit of string tying them together, but it's not, because if there was a family, each person in that family would be interconnected and independent, but they'd also be independent, right? They have their own identity, their own personality. They want to do their own things also. So it's that kind of combination of things being interconnected, but also interdependent that creates that complexity. And particularly when you have a lot of different elements or agents in the system, and they're all doing their own thing, but they're also interacting and interdependent. And that gives rise to the emergence of patterns of organization that creates a lot of complexity. So complexity here, going from a simple system to a complex system, it's really the number of parts. A lot more parts, more complexity. Degree of connectivity, when it becomes very highly connected, it becomes more complex. Degree of interdependence, if there's very low interdependence, if they're separate parts, then it's relatively simple. And it's also about the degree of autonomy, right? If these parts, as I say, were stones, then they don't have much autonomy. They're not like cats, which are going to jump up and run around and do their own thing, right? So when you turn up that adaptive capacity of the agents in the system, it becomes a lot more complex. So if you take any system that has those properties, right? Many parts, highly interconnected, interdependent parts, which are also autonomous and adaptive, then you're going to have a complex system. And that's what we're talking about here. And these are all examples of complex systems. So the global biosphere, right, incredibly complex, has so many different elements, right, on so many different levels, so many different types of elements. Also, it's diversity. They're biotic, they're abiotic, you know, water, soil, atmosphere, light, so on and so forth, all these different plants. And of course, they're interacting and they're interdependent. If the wind patterns or if the ocean currents change in one part of the world, that's going to affect, you know, the biodiversity in that. You know, the coral reefs there, El Nino, the changes in El Nino affect the coral reef here. They affect the fishing, that the fish population, which affects then the local economies, so on and so forth. So there's all those elements interacting. There's dependence, cities, complex adaptive systems, financial markets, all these different agents, buying and selling. And they're all, of course, they're interdependent, right? What other institutions do matters. It affects the price. So they're interdependent with each other, but each agent gets to make its own choices about what it's going to do, if it's going to buy or if it's going to sell. So again, you have that dynamic. You have many agents in the global financial system, many different types of actors. They're making their own decisions. They're interacting, interdependent, and we get the emergence of overall patterns of organizations, social networks, likewise. These are all complex systems. And that's what we're trying to understand in complexity theory, right? And the idea is that these things that are complex are very different from these things that are simple. They're fundamentally different, right? They're not just a little bit different. They're actually, the way they work is fundamentally different. And that's why we have a science of complexity. If they weren't fundamentally different, this would all just fit in the normal paradigm of modern science, and we probably wouldn't be very interested in it. It's because it's fundamentally different that we're interested in this stuff. Okay, so I have a little exercise for you people. I want you to grab a sticky here on the left-hand side and plunk it down. I want you to answer the question, which one of these is a complex system and which is not? I'll share the link now again in a second. So let's just take a look. This is the electrical grid of the United States of America. This is a spider web. Is that a complex system? This is a boat. Is that a complex system? This is looks like a global transport system, global supply chain. Do you think that's a complex system? This is some kind of group kind of dynamic, a social network of some kind. Do you think that's a complex system? If you could try, say if it is or it isn't, and maybe say a few words about why you think it is or why you think it is not. This is a set of billiard balls. This is a manufacturing robot. This down here is a city. Which one of those? You don't have to do all of them. You can just choose a few that you like and maybe write a few words about why you think it's complex or not a complex system. Okay, I'll share the link with you again now for those latecomers. There you go. If anybody needs help, you can put it in the chat there. We'll just take a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, let's take a little look at what you've got here. You can stay posting if you're still doing that. So here we are, the electrical grid of the United States of America. Quite incredible. Obviously an engineered system, right? We built this ourselves. Is it a complex system? Not complex. Who's this? Someone want to talk on that? You're welcome to unmute yourself. Tell us why you think this isn't complex. Okay, so yep.
Well, I haven't maybe put enough thought into it just yet, but it feels to me that there aren't so much autonomous separate parts, although I have to admit I don't really understand exactly how it works. It was more of a gut feel, I've got to be honest.
So it also depends kind of what we're talking about here, right? Maybe Lee, you're thinking you're maybe thinking of this as a technical system. Maybe you're thinking of, power cables and, sockets and so forth. But actually, if we take this as a whole, really, this is a very, very, very complex system. It's evolved over, this wasn't built as one thing, right? This thing's evolved over a very long, over 100 years. And many different grids here. You can see that already. We know, we heard in Texas when they had that power outage and the freezing and so forth. We know that that's an autonomous grid there, right? It's its own thing. And so are many of these other ones. And actually, there's a massive amount of companies involved in this, and they're all making decisions about whether they should lay cables here or whether they should be doing this fuel or that fuel, or how they're going to compete in these markets and so forth. And no one has really planned this thing. There's no kind of obviously the government can put regulation in, it can guide it and so forth. But actually, this is an incredibly complex system and it's also multi-dimensional, right? There's obviously the technology, there's the engineers, there's the consumers, there's a lot of finance involved, there's a lot of different companies involved, so on and so forth. This really is a complex system for sure. But again, it's always good to kind of clarify what specifically we're talking about here. But so here, lots of parts, lots of dependent cities, and each city uses their electricity autonomously. Yes, okay, complex because there is multiple inputs and outputs. Electrical grid, yes, different actors, factors, regions, engaging who act independently, continues to impact outcomes and system as a whole. Yes, complex, complex, complex. Okay, great. So down here, we've got some kind of global logistics or some kind of, it's probably the air transport system. So complex, many parts that need to connect. A breakdown in one place can affect many others. Yes, so what happened in the Suez Canal was a good example, wasn't it? One ship getting stuck, and we saw how that rippled across the whole global supply chain. So complex because there are many airline flights, each operating independently, and routes can change depending on how flights are operating at the same time and place. Sometimes routes will be redirected based upon weather, incidents on the ground. Yep. And pricing too. You think about the very interesting how they do pricing in the global air transport system. That's very dynamic too. If something comes along, then they're going to quickly up their prices or down them or whatever it is. It's a very dynamic system. So way complex. Okay, great. So this here, it's a boat, not complex. The boat itself has many components: the kitchen, the crew, the engine, the load, which have their own dynamics. Complex, okay? Complex has many different aspects, rules, legislation involved. Yeah, I'd say that's more about the overall supply chain, though, these kind of rules and legislation and so forth. I'd say this is relatively simple, right? Because it doesn't have those autonomous parts, does it? Right? The parts of that ship are not going to actually answer back to you. The freight and so forth is going to do what you tell it to do. This is relatively simple. Another thing here is that complexity is always relative, right? Nothing's absolutely simple, nothing's absolutely complex. So it's always a question of relative, I would say. So this one here, billiard balls, complex, not complex. The game is not a system, no relation, connections, no interdependence, not complex, but has some elements because the balls are interconnected. but there's only a single agent and they do not move autonomously. So again, I'd say this is a simple system because the agents, the actors in that system, the elements, the balls are actually inert, right? They're not, imagine how complex that little thing there, that little collection gets if it's a group of teenagers or something like this, people who are making their own decisions, they're interacting and doing things. This thing's actually deterministic, right? If you hit the ball in there, you could do a whole pile of maths and computer simulation and figure out what's going to happen. So it's relatively simple compared to, if those were companies within a market, right? We really wouldn't be able to, if one was doing something, upped its prices or whatever, others would react and act and so forth. So I'd say that's relatively simple. I'd say this is relatively simple, this robot, again, because it's a deterministic system. A robot is not a complex system. As its states are defined. Yep. There's no real emergence in a robot either. We talked about that last time. We'll talk a bit about it again in a minute. So down here, a city is certainly a complex system. This is a complex system. It is made up of many different subsystems. Yep. And they're all interacting and interdependent. Complex because living and non-living systems are involved in the city. Yep. Okay. Great, I hope that was useful. I'm going to, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we say a complex system. And as I say, it's all relative, but particularly when you have agents, when you have adaptive agents in the system, then it gets complex very quickly. Like I say, a family can just have 4 people in it, but because each of them has a very sophisticated kind of adaptation mechanisms and so forth, it can be complex. Okay. So that's a complex system. And one of the first, you may have heard this, people talk a lot about self-organization when they in complexity theory. One of the first questions we're interested in when we look at any system is the question of, if there is some order there, how did it get there? Right. And obviously a city, right? There's a lot of order here. And how did that order get there? And in this system, the answer is pretty simple. There's one reason why I'd say it's not a complex system. Engineers came along and they figured all this stuff out and they built that robot and manufactured it, right? And the order in that system was imposed on it, right? External agents, the engineers, the designers, the manufacturers, they imposed order on that physical system and they came up with this robot. That's one way of getting order in a system, and it works because this is a simple system. If you down here, there's another way of getting order in a system, right? Systems can create their own order, their own organization, and we call that self-organization. And these are normally adaptive agents, right? People, as I said, they have their own ideas, their motives, they're able to adapt and so forth. And they don't necessarily need someone to come in from the outside and tell them what to do. They could figure that out themselves, peer to peer. One person can say, I have an idea, another person says, oh, that's a good idea, but let's try this. Another person says that and that. And they come up with their own way of organizing themselves. And again, this thing here, actually, a lot of this was kind of self-organizing or evolved over a prolonged period of time. No one had a big plan and came in and said, like, you know, someone with this robot, people had a plan here. They had a blueprint and they said, we're going to make a robot. And they went and did that, right? It's not what happened down here in this city either, was it? Like someone didn't just come in and say, let's build a city and let's do it. That thing again evolved, and there are many different actors acting and reacting to each other's behavior there to figure out ultimately how this thing was gonna evolve over a long period of time. We call that self-organization, and that is what happens in complex systems because no one's in control in a complex system normally, right? Normally you have many small parts and they're distributed out like this global supply chain here. No one's in control, right? The global financial system, no one's in control of the global financial system. No one created the global financial system. Many, many different actors built that thing because in that instance, they saw the opportunities that they could have by connecting to each other. right? Within it, within the subsystems, right? America controls its own airspace, you know, Europe and India and so forth. But actually, you'd find if you went to the global level on most systems, they're too complex to have some kind of top-down system that manages the whole thing. And finance is a good example. We know with the financial crisis, there's no one actor that can step in and control the entire system. So that's the kind of the nature of a complex system. They're normally distributed out with many different parts, and order emerges through the interaction of those parts. And we call that self-organization. So self-organization is one of the major themes within complex systems and a pervasive phenomenon in our world. Complex organizations like schools of fish, ant colonies, or car traffic manage to organize themselves into emergent patterns without any form of global coordination. There's no one in the center telling everyone what to do. This is somewhat counterintuitive to our traditional assumptions, where we tend to assume that organization and order need to be imposed by some external entity. Self-organization fascinates many people precisely because it's generated internally. The system generates its own organization. Hurricanes, consciousness, the swarming of bees are other examples of organization emerging out of the interaction between the component parts. And this is another one here. It's one of my favorite ones, examples of self-organization. It's people crossing a street. Maybe this is not the best image, but normally when you have a dense street and people are crossing, we can't walk through each other. So what we do is we try to find ways around. And the first people who cross the street and meet the other people, they negotiate with them to go around them. But the people who come after them, they just follow the people in front. And that creates normally some kind of a stream of people going in different directions. And that's an example of self-organization, because there's no one here there's no traffic warden there telling everyone where to go. But over the course of 30 seconds or a minute, you'll see a pattern of organization emerges as streams going in different directions. And that all happened out of the local interaction between the people in the system. So how did that actually happen? And this is kind of how it works. Self-organization always needs some randomness in the beginning, right? This system wouldn't have self-organized if there was traffic wardens there telling everyone what to do. Said everybody on this side go in that direction, everybody on the other side go in the other direction. You know what? They wouldn't have self-organized if that was the case. It only self-organized because there wasn't a traffic warden there, right? No one was there to tell them what to do or where to go, so they organized themselves, right? So self-organization always takes an initial state of disorder. Then it takes peer interaction. So you can't have self-organization if the system is already organized. You can't have self-organization if there's no interaction between the agents. Everything comes from the interaction between the agents. So the order here, how did it emerge? It came out of this person walking this direction, these people coming in the opposite direction, and they looked at each other and they said, I don't want to bump into you, I'm going to go around you, and then the other people followed them. So that was peer interaction. No one told them to do that. They did it through the local interaction only. And then you need positive feedback, which basically means that if I'm the first person crossing the street, I have to do that negotiation. I have to figure that out with the person coming towards me. And that takes a bit of time, it's a bit of friction. But the second person, the third person, is just going to follow that first person because they've already created a pathway and it's the easiest way to go. And that makes it, that's a kind of positive feedback, right? Because the more people that follow that first person, the easier it is for you to keep on following that stream and for you to get across the street without the friction of bumping into other people. And ultimately what happens is you create a stream of people going in one direction, people going the other direction, which is a very efficient system, right? Because no one's going to bump into other people. And you've created a sort of a tractor, we call them, which basically means it's the simplest way for you to get across the street. We'll put it like that. It's created a pattern of organization, a system of some kind that is the most effective way of doing things. And that all came not because someone told them where to go or what to do. It came from the local interaction. It came from this kind of a dynamic here. And that's how order emerges when there's no one in control and it's pure interaction and self-organization. It's down here, you can find it in the guide. But there has to be this initial state of disorder. There has to be these autonomous agents that are interacting with each other, and then you get positive feedback, and then you get the emergence of some pattern of organization. Another example would be in finance, right? You can imagine there's a group of banks here. They use the existing SWIFT interbank system or whatever it is to transfer money between themselves. But actually it's not very effective or efficient. It takes a few days to get money from one bank to another, probably costs a bit of money. Someone comes up with a blockchain. They say, okay, me and you could exchange money much faster if you use my protocol here. And so they negotiate a protocol, they're able to transfer money much faster and so forth. And then they go to other banks and they say, look, we're using this super fast protocol. It'd be much more efficient if you came and joined us. Let's all get together, use this protocol. And then it becomes much more easy for them to exchange money between them, right? So that's an attractor. People will want to join that because it's much more efficient than the existing system. And the more people that join that protocol, the more effective it's going to be until everybody in the system will want to join it because everyone else is using it. So it creates a positive feedback and attractor. Okay, let's test you guys out on that. Let's try this one here. Which one of these do you think is self-organizing? Which one do you think is not self-organizing? So let's take a look at what we've got. We've got some logs here, school of fish, billiard balls again. So this one's here's a snowflake. This is a tricky one. Do you think that's self-organizing? Do you think this plant is self-organizing? Swarm of bees, flock of birds, traffic, bubbles, some form of community there. Okay, I'll let you guys jump in there. We'll take a couple of minutes. Do you think they're creating their own organization through that process I just talked about, local interactions, giving rise to the emergence of overall patterns? Or do you think the pattern was created by some kind of external force? Or maybe there is no pattern at all? I'll share the link again for the newcomers. Okay, for the sake of time, I'll jump in, take a look what we've got. So this here, is this self-organized? Some of these ones are a little bit tricky. They're not too simple to find the answer to. I'd say this one here, actually, I'm not sure. I don't think it is self-organizing because actually there's no pattern, there's no real pattern of organization there, right? They're kind of just a random group of people who are standing around for some reason. So I wouldn't say it's self-organizing, actually. Is this one here self-organizing? Self-organizing wouldn't dare to drive there. Yeah, it is self-organizing. Okay. Yes, it is. Look at this. We've got certain patterns of traffic flow there, and it's well known. Traffic is a complex system for sure. And it's out of that. There's obviously some people are planning this in some sense, or they're creating the framework within which all this happens. But then, of course, we have these agents in the system, right? All those people get to choose what they do, and there's interaction between them. And patterns of organization, like traffic jams, are well-known self-organizing patterns of organization. So for sure it is. This one here. So firstly, is there a pattern here? That there is, right? Just like down here. There's got to be a pattern, or else there's no self-organization. We see there's a pattern there. There's definitely a pattern here. We know that these birds aren't doing this randomly. They're doing it for a specific reason. Doesn't seem like there's any one real boss, right, telling them all what to do. This is more, again, like a self-organizing process. So self-organization as the birds decide on their path of flight and order themselves. Yeah, so this is a form of self-organizing system. They do it because it creates a more effective pattern for them to fly in, reduces the drag and energy consumption and so forth. Is this snowflake self-organizing? Yes, it is self-organizing. Yes, no, determined by the structure of the molecules, so not self-organizing. Yes, yes, and in a pattern. These are well-known self-organizing systems also. So an interesting one because they're physical systems, right? They're not, most self-organizing systems are, creatures, humans, they have adaptive capacity. This is self-organizing due to the kind of molecular positive or negative charges which attract other molecules. The whole thing is actually peer-to-peer interaction, self-organizing. It's quite incredible. It creates these amazing fractal patterns. I'd recommend you take a look at some videos on YouTube on that. Really interesting. Yep, these guys are self-organizing. The queen bee actually isn't really in charge. She doesn't really give orders or anything. Beehives are very much self-organizing systems. Biological systems like this are actually self-organizing. The way it develops, right? Us, as we develop, we have cells in our bodies, and they grow and they interact locally with other cells to determine what kind of cells they should become and when they should stop growing, so on and so forth. So it is actually the development of a plant like that is self-organizing. For sure, these fish self-organizing. We can see an amazing pattern there. They're figuring that out. Local interactions, they're looking at other fish near them, just like the flock of birds. This one over here, for sure, it's not. Anybody want to tell us why it's not self-organizing? Anybody want to unmute? We've got a few no's here. External energy.
I don't think it's particularly organized at all, is it?
For sure, it's organized. Yeah, I mean, someone's piled up a pile of logs there, right? That's not what it would look like if no one was organizing this thing. But as I say, someone did that to that system. They imported the energy, they imported the information, right? We're going to put this in this path. So, okay, those are self-organizing. This one here, I wouldn't say it is because, again, there's no pattern there. They're just a random group of cows, right? So if there's no, we can see here, there's certainly a pattern. And that pattern was created by the local interactions. No one imported it, told them to do that. This is not self-organizing for sure. What about this one? Not self-organizing, certainly imposed externally. And okay, so why are we interested in this in terms of systems innovation and systems change? Well, one thing we can think about is we often bring this mentality that systems have to be organized by us. We have to organize them. We have to do something to them if we want to get order. And we have to figure that order out, and we have to impose it. We have to plan it, so on and so forth. And what complexity theory is telling us here is that a lot of systems that we didn't expect, like this snowflake down here, they organize themselves, right? And that's somewhat counterintuitive. A lot of our intuition is that if we want something organized, we're going to have to organize it. We're going to have a plan. We're going to have to do it. And we're saying here that doesn't have to be the case. And that's very useful because it tells us in systems change and so forth that we don't have to come up with a plan, right? We maybe just have to figure out the dynamics, right? As I told you back here, it's not random. There are dynamics. So if we could figure out these dynamics and maybe build some kind of a structure, then maybe this system could self-organize. That could be a health system, that could be a financial market, that could be traffic system, whatever it is. So this is one of the kind of paradigm shifts that we need to stop thinking that we always have to impose order on things, right? And that, again, and also that everything should be orderly, because we're saying here, sometimes we need a bit of disorder if the system's going to organize itself. When in fact, we'll find that we always seem to be kind of thinking that order is really what we should be going for. When we're saying here complexity, that sometimes systems need a bit of disorder to be able to regenerate themselves and to self-organize and so forth. But the general takeaway is this idea that some systems can, all of these systems here, right? And they're all the ones we're interested in systems innovation, as I say, supply chains, healthcare systems, educational systems, energy markets, they're all self-organizing systems. So maybe if we figure these dynamics out in those contexts, we can learn how to work with it, and we wouldn't have to control and kind of do that planning and predicting on everything. Okay, so that's that. That's self-organization. Now we're gonna touch quite quickly, because we're probably gonna run out of time, on non-linearity. An important aspect, maybe you've heard of this idea that complex systems, they're non-linear. What's the opposite of non-linear? Well, it's linear. And this thing here is called Newton's cradle, and it's an archetype of linear thinking and linear interaction. One thing hits another, and it hits another and another, and so forth. That's linear causality. So let's take a look down here. Yeah, let's just jump into what this is, a linear system. So linear systems are really kind of just defined by two things. It's saying that the combined result in a system will be nothing more than simple addition of each component's parts. So it's this idea of additivity, that when we put two things together, the whole is going to be nothing more than the sum of the parts. And that's true for simpler systems, right? A pile of stones, if we just weigh up the weight of all those stones, the whole is going to be nothing more than the sum of all of those parts put together. And that's one feature of linear systems. And that the input is usually proportional to the output. So this is a good illustration of that, right? When this ball hits this one down here, we know that the force going from there to there is then going to be pushed into the next ball and pushed into the next ball and so forth. And it's very kind of linear. The input is equal to the output of the system. And that's what kind of breaks down with nonlinear systems. Maybe you've heard of chaos theory and this idea of the butterfly effect, right? A small, I think I have a graphic here. Do I have a graphic here? Yeah, here's the butterfly effect. Maybe you've heard of this. Small butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil or China, wherever it is, and it ends up in a hurricane somewhere else in the world, a big storm. How does that happen? That's obviously non-linear, right? Input is wildly disproportionate to the output, or the output is very disproportionate to the input. Feedback loops, right, that amplifies some small input. Edward Laurence in France, and he was doing, he had differential equations. He put them into his computer to try and simulate the weather, and he changed it, very small little input. These computer iterative functions. It took the input and it iterated it many times, and it got a very big difference in the output when he changed the input very slight bit by 5 decimal points or something. And that's because inside the computers are doing calculations and they're iterating through that, right? They're computing something and taking the output, putting it into the input of the next one, iterating it again, putting it into the input to the next one, iterating again. And that means each time the small difference is getting amplified and amplified and amplified. And that's creating positive feedback. And with positive feedback, you can get chaotic behavior, where small or nonlinear behavior, where a small change in input can lead to large changes in output. And that's what we're talking about down here. Someone's doing something with all the boards here. Okay, I fixed it. Okay, so I want to show you what that looks like. There's a great little video here. This here, it's called a double pendulum, and it's really a very good, perfect, almost perfect expression of what I just talked about there, chaotic behavior. So we start off here with a single pendulum, right? There's no joint in the center there. And he's going to swing it, and you'll see that it's very predictable. It's very deterministic, this system. If you look at it, very, very simple, right? All of us know what's going to happen next. We could predict generally what that looked like. Mathematically, you know, a computer could figure that out very quickly. Now, he's going to undo the joint in the middle so that there's two limbs to this pendulum. And take a look at what happens. This is chaos. Look at that. Pretty amazing, huh? Totally unpredictable. Who would have expected that it would do all those funny moves and so forth? And it's unpredictable, as I say, right? And all he did was give a small input at the beginning, small little push to it, and then off it went, doing all sorts of dynamical things. Why was that? It was because it had two interacting parts to it, right? And there's a certain kind of feedback between it, which takes it off in certain unpredictable directions, as opposed to the first one, which didn't have the interaction between those different parts. So that's saying in a dynamical system where you have different interacting parts, you can get feedback loops. Positive feedback, which drive the system off in a particular direction very quickly. It's these positive feedback loops here that do that, which means it just means when something happens, something else comes along to reinforce it and keep driving it in the same direction. Like in financial markets, there's a loss of trust in banks, then less people, more people will want their money out, and then other people will see that and they'll lose faith in it also, and then they'll take and they'll keep on self-amplifying, right? And that's going to create, and we know from that how quickly bank runs can happen, right? A small little event here, a little loss of confidence, and then more people lose confidence, and then other people see, oh, there's a problem there, so I'm going to take my money out, and they lose their confidence. And that keeps on amplifying and amplifying itself. And we know how fast financial crisis can happen. And that's an example of a positive feedback loop, and how unpredictable it is also. How bad we are at predicting financial crisis is quite interesting. We've got a massive amount of very intelligent people with lots of computers and mathematics, but we still can't figure out when a financial crisis is coming. And that's a lot to do with these positive people. We don't know where those tipping points are. We don't know where those feedback loops are or when they're going to happen, so on and so forth. So yeah, I'd like you to jump in here. Actually, a quick question for you. Which one of these do you think, so this is the difference between linear and non-linear change. Which one of these do you think is capable of linear or non-linear change? If you could just grab a sticky, post it up. If you think it's linear, the change here is going to be linear. When I knock one of those dominoes or you knock one of those dominoes, is the change going to be linear or non-linear? Here we have a group of bacteria. Do you think these bacteria are going to grow at a linear rate or a non-linear rate? If we put some food in there and they start reproducing financial markets, do you think things can change here linear or non-linear? This one here, so it's an airplane, is it linear? We're talking about its motion in space. Is it going to be linear or non-linear? So I'll share the link with you. Okay, I'm going to stay flicking through them for the sake of time. So, yeah, you got it right, all of you. It's linear, right? Why is the change here linear? Because there's no feedback loop, is there, right? When you push one of these, it's just going to knock the next one, right? And the next one's not going to kind of amplify that in any way. So there's no positive feedback, which means it's not going to go exponential. What about this one? Yep, you got it right, non-linear. Why, anybody want to tell me why this is non-linear? The growth here could be? Why could the population grow at an exponential rate?
Autonomous parts.
Anybody else?
Self-organization.
Well, is there a feedback loop here? There is a feedback loop, isn't there? Because it's just like over here, right? What's happening with the reproduction is that you have a few here, of the population, they're reproducing, they're creating more offspring, but that means there's going to be a larger population, which are going to create even more offspring next time. So each time you're feeding back the output from the last time into the input for the next one, and you're going to keep on doing that. And again, a small change, it can compound itself and it's going to grow exponentially, which is the case here. So it's non-linear. The change can be non-linear. Okay, these guys can be both linear sometimes, but quite often non-linear, right? There are periods when it's linear, but then we know we get financial crisis and it goes non-linear. And this one here for sure, right? There's no feedback loop. When the airplane goes forwards, it just goes forwards. That doesn't feed back on itself to make it go faster next time, you know? So again, it's linear. And this is, we can see here, it's quite predictable. If you see an airplane flying across the sky, you have a pretty clear idea where it's going and how long it's going to take just to move across the sky there. We don't, as I said, we don't really know about this. And this here is very much counterintuitive, right? The speed at which these will develop, it'll be quite slow initially, and then it gets faster and faster, and it gets very fast at the end. So they are counterintuitive nonlinear systems. They change very quickly, and we get chaotic behavior. Okay, just quickly before we wrap up, because we've kind of run out of time, maybe take an extra 5 minutes or so. We'll talk a little bit about networks, obviously an important part of complex systems. It's really the architecture, it's the structure. Let's just maybe just take a look at some of these here. So this is actually transport or travel. It's travel between these different cities. And this forms something of a complex system. It's a set of nodes, set of elements and relationships between them and how they're interconnected. And then they're scaled. They're obviously colored according to continents. We've got America over here and South America and so forth. And then the scale of the node is essentially how many passengers are flowing through it. And then we can see the connections between them. Another one here, which is links on Twitter. These are hashtags and how they're interconnected. And down here, actually, this is an interesting one. This is arms trade in South Africa. So the case study considered analyzing the South African arms deals, specifically seeking to identify corruption within a network of defense contractors, bidders, companies, key individuals, and various other parties. So this is a link between trading of weapons in South Africa between different parties, different individuals. And we can see there are obviously some people at the center of that, and there are other people out on the edges. Some people are really holding this network together. And there's a lot of structure there. And the idea, complexity theory, we want to understand that structure. How is that organized? What's that kind of organization? Can we say much about it? There's a lot of ideas over here. Let's take a look at some of them. how we can analyze that network, right? Looking at clustering within the network here, linkages between one place and another, which nodes are playing really important linkages, maybe in a supply chain. How close are the nodes to each other? How easy is it to make a connection? What's the number of connections an individual node has? That's a very important question. Who's the most important person in this social network? So on and so forth. And many other questions we can ask there also. We can see here other ways of analyzing a network, degree of centrality. This here is asking the question, who's the most important node in this network? That's often the question we want to ask. It might be a terrorist network, right? Or it might be financial exchanges between people. Or it might be, spreading a coronavirus or whatever it is. And we're asking, which are the most important nodes here? And actually, there's many different ways of asking them, right? So, or answering that question. So this node is obviously very important because it's bridging between one network and another. This one here has a lot of connections, so it's very important. This one here is called Closeness Centrality, which means it's close to a lot of other nodes in the network. It makes it easy to connect to them. This one here is called Eigenvector Centrality, which basically means it is close to a lot of other nodes, which are close to other nodes. Or it's it's basically saying, if this is a social network, it's saying this person knows a lot of other people who know a lot of other people, all right? So those are just different ways of analyzing a network and asking that question, which one's important. But there are many different questions we could ask, the robustness of this network, or diffusion. How is something going to spread? We've been talking a lot about that with Corona and so forth. How are things spreading across the network? How can we prevent it, or how can we enable it? With the pandemic, it was all about social distancing and so forth. Other things we might want to enable that spreading might be entrepreneurship within a small community in rural Africa or somewhere. How can we promote that, the spreading of that? So this is what complexity theory and network science would help us with, to really help us understand these networks, how they form, how they develop, who are the important actors. It could be social media. Who should we be influencing here? Obviously, a message, if we talk to this person here in the center, message is going to spread a lot quicker than if we talk to this one person here, because from her, it's going to have to go to him or to him to get somewhere else in the network. So these are the questions we're asking. And all complex systems have this architecture, right? They have this network to them because they're highly interconnected and interdependent. And if we want to understand them, we need to understand networks. Okay, guys, we're going to wrap up there. Thank you very much for joining. I hope this was useful. I hope it's given you some insight into understanding complex systems. Obviously, just like I say, this is a vast area. I spent many years studying it, and you could spend the rest of your life studying it. And it's also a kind of a cutting edge science. So a lot of it we still don't understand. But I would say there's some really key ideas around non-linearity, around understanding connectivity in networks, around the first one we talked about back here, self-organization and so forth. There's also another important aspect around adaptation, evolution, and that'll actually be the next section in the series that we'll be covering in a month from now in our next event. So we're going to wrap up now. Just a couple of things for our London hub. If you want to, you can find us on LinkedIn here. You just click on that link there. You can find our hub channel on the website and become a member there. Upcoming events, we've got one on serious play. How do we use play for systems innovation? And that's in about 2 weeks. And then later next month, we have one on systems innovation for circular economies. And you can find them by clicking the link there or going onto the website. But I'll wrap up for now, and I hope to see you again in a month when we talk more about complex adaptive systems. Great, thank you.